In this episode, Jahed and I spoke with Christopher Goebs of Anoma, a new suite of software tools that helps anyone build online systems that better coordinate individuals. Rather than design the governance and tokenomics into the blockchain protocol itself, Anoma abstracts this idea, empowering the end users to have as much control as possible over the architecture. Listeners interested in the limitation of proof of work and proof of stake blockchains will be interested in Anoma's vision. Hope you enjoy the episode.
Christopher, thanks for joining us, man. You've had a super interesting intellectual and work history. I've just been diving in, looking at Anoma, looking at Heliax, all the things you've been involved in. Can you tell us a bit about yourself as a person and where you came from and how you got involved in all this?
Let's see if I can unravel. I feel like it's easy to do all this kind of reverse reason about your own history or even the history of other things and concoct some coherent narrative where it didn't really exist. So try and give credit to randomness where credit is really due. I think lots of parts of my story, at least, are random. I grew up in countryside in Oregon, which among other attributes has cheap power. And I was a pretty bored 16-year-old with no car and an internet connection who read Slashdot occasionally. And I found out about Bitcoin and realized I could use my parents' energy to mine some Bitcoin using GPUs. At that point, I played some computer games. I knew a little bit, not very much, but enough to think that I was dangerous about how to build a computer. So I built a GPU miner for Bitcoin back when that was a thing. So this was back when Bitcoin was like a few dollars or something. And at that point, usually, I actually wanted to use Bitcoin as a currency. I was too young to have a card and I didn't really understand how the banking system worked, but I wanted to pay for a virtual servers, host my own website and do other random things. And I played around with Ubuntu on my computer, installed the Bitcoin daemon, actually used the old Bitcoin QT wallet, right? Just wanted to use this cool thing. So that was originally how I got involved in things. And at that point, I freely admit there wasn't a lot of detailed reasoning or historical context or ideological reflection. I was just playing around. And even back then, it's funny to watch history repeat itself in different cycles of different things. Back then, no one called it this then, but there was this sort of financial ecosystem emerging on top of Bitcoin, which didn't have any kind of decentralized settlement layer, but where people just wanted to make interesting financial instruments. And I'm sure there were profit motives involved in lots of cases. There was, for a while, a Ponzi scheme ran by a guy called Pirate at 40, or he went by Pirate at 40. I think his real name was Trendon Shavers. He lived in Texas or something, on the Bitcoin forums. And he, just a high yield interest Ponzi scheme, right? Pretty direct. But someone else made on this other website called the Global Bitcoin Stock Exchange, someone else made a bond, which of course bought into this Ponzi scheme, but didn't quite advertise it. So there was this whole layer of decentralized financial abstraction, or so to speak. Of course, it wasn't actually decentralized, but in that it kind of didn't matter. You saw the same story playing out then as I think you see now in lots of cases, right, in terms of the economics of the thing, even if technology was different. So, of course, to do my best to admit the history here. At that point, although I didn't directly invest in the Ponzi scheme, I was definitely playing around and exposed to it. So lost some Bitcoins. Not gonna talk about how much, but that was.
I feel everyone has to have one of those stories, right? Where it's you bought some, you participated in a shady thing, and you learned a lesson that you never repeated, right?
Yeah, also for me at the time, it was really just a game. I wasn't trying to. It was a Bitcoin was the equivalent of imaginary internet points in, I also played RuneScape, right? And RuneScape had gold. And for me, it was kind of the same thing. None of this had any relation to physical production or my means of livelihood, because I was just a teenager living with my parents, who provided shelter and food and other socialist things. For me, it was just this fun online game where people, whatnot. There were interesting discussions on the Bitcoin Talk forums and all of these crazy people who wanted to argue about politics. That was, at the time, not something I could access physically where I lived. So, yeah, I just enjoyed it.
Some things end up being the same, how they're timeless. Arguing about politics in Web3 community or crypto communities, absolutely. A timeless endeavor.
Yeah, sure. So maybe to fast forward a bit. So I did that a little bit in high school, mostly did stuff completely unrelated to decentralized technology or blockchain or cryptocurrencies or anything in college. did some work on underwater autonomous submarines. Turns out, unfortunately, those are only used in industry by the US government to do military things, which wasn't really my stick. So moved away from that, did astronomy for a little while, which I liked very much, but wasn't super happy with the academic funding situation. I ended up did some work on a NASA grant, which, as far as I could tell, the only reason we were doing the research was that grant money was available for it. Like, that was the rationale. There wasn't a scientific basis for we wanted to investigate. We were looking at data from the Spitzer Space Telescope, a spectrum of different stars, and conducting analysis, which is interesting. But like, I never discovered a rationale for why we were conducting that analysis, or what sort of theoretical basis we were looking to understand, or even what hypothesis was being tested, other than there was NASA grant money and it was dedicated to studying this specific piece of data. To me, that was just like very jarring. And I've wanted to experiment with other things. So after college, played around with stuff for a bit and ended up kind of randomly. I mean, also, to be honest and give credit to randomness, for a while, I needed to support myself because I didn't have a regular job. I needed to like pay my rent in New York City for a few months. And I just looked for hackathons with high prize pools where I could potentially make a little bit of cash in various ways. One of the hackathons I found was, at that point in time, a Cosmos hackathon. This was before the project launch, so many years ago. And I built a sort of simple private voting system using linkable ring signatures on Tendermint, written Pascal, actually. And I did not win the hackathon. I only got second place. But at that point in time, I learned about Cosmos. And then, maybe 6 months later, I just ended up randomly having a call with a few people at Tendermint, including Ethan Buckman. And I was really interested in interoperability because, to me, at least, I've been reading at that point in time about polycentric law and some other like theories of heterogeneous legal jurisdictions. And it seemed to me like different blockchains with different legal jurisdictions, and people would want lots of different, like, everyone should run their own legal jurisdiction, but they might want to interoperate. So interoperability would be a big deal. And I thought that was an interesting design challenge. That was what attracted me to the Cosmos project, was that it was really anti-maximalist.
Got it.
Kind of self-sovereign.
And so, to like give the folks on the pod who have no idea what some of these things are, a little bit of background. Cosmos is a project that was launched in about 2017. It provides a number of software features that let people launch their own blockchains. So if you're coming to this from thinking about Ethereum and Bitcoin and Ethereum virtual machines, and maybe you've heard of those, right? Cosmos has a number, it's really more of a philosophy than a particular blockchain. It has a particular set of SDK, software development kits, and other patterns that everyone can use to launch their own app chains. And then the reason why people like it, and others are critical of it, there's a lot of drama, but is that these things can interoperate with a set of patterns. And so there's things like inter-blockchain communication, there's a shared security, there's a lot. What I like to tell people, like, why is it interesting, is that and this is a little controversial, but Cosmos has kind of ignored the idea that if you're involved in blockchain, you've seen Ethereum, like, people are obsessed with scaling, and people are obsessed with a number of things here. And that's what all of the ETH 2.0 stuff, all the years and years of the various Berlin and other upgrades have been looking at, why there are layer 2 solutions. Cosmos has kind of focused on security and interoperability, and has found almost, in my opinion, a backdoor to scaling through that as well. So just a little bit of background on Cosmos. You're like, what is this Cosmos thing that people are talking about? So now we've kind of arrived there. How did the idea for Anoma come about?
It was a long process. I would say what exactly the delineations of projects are always like difficult to determine, and different people have different ideas, and these things become conflated with tokens and investments and other kind of generally tribal means of organization. I mean, personally, I'd like to still consider myself a member of the Cosmos project. I still work on IBC a little bit, submit PRs or review proposed spec changes there sometimes. I'm still good friends with lots of people in the Cosmos community. So if the people are the important thing, I'm really, like, some sense, still part of Cosmos in addition to Anoma. I think those could be very permeated communities. They don't need to be somehow opposed to each other. Ditto for Ethereum, frankly. So I joined Cosmos to work on blockchain interoperability. I would say that, like, some of the time was spent on that, but considerably more time was spent on human interoperability for various reasons. There are lots of course, sometimes I think, like, decentralization as a thesis permeates into organizational structures in interesting ways, and ways in which I'm not sure all was taken into consideration. Like, a lot of historical reflection on how organizational structures work or don't work. I think decentralization can easily become fetish. And sometimes you end up with like very chaotic organizations that just don't, the organization does not always need to reflect like the philosophy of the software you're building, right? Of course, Gresham's law, sometimes it does. So there are interesting contrasts here. For a while, I worked at the company Tendermint, which then, due to some differences in opinion between engineers and management, kind of split apart. The engineering team unionized informally, if not legally, and formed a separate company called IG, which still exists today. And a different sort of part of the engineering team, particularly associated with Ethan Buckman, split earlier and formed Informal Systems. And those companies right now do the majority of development on Cosmos. They're doing a wonderful job. So a while after I had sort of co-founded IG with some of the other engineers from the Cosmos project at the time, and a while after that, I'd also had a proof of stake validator going on with Adrian and the other co-founders of Anoma. And I thought, like, I was just reflecting, where can I add the most like value in the comparative organizational landscape? To me, that's an important question. Different organizations do different things. And often it's like just not contrast on both sides here, but if you want to do something, it's helpful to have different organizations which do different things. One reason why I think like the convergence of everything to a venture capital fund is like very concerning, because then it's just all the organizations are doing the same thing. So it's not that the thing is bad, but if everyone is doing the same thing, then there's not a lot of diversity. And without diversity, you don't really have resilience, and you don't have like over time, just like in a natural ecosystem, the system tends to be very brittle. So I really wanted to focus on research, and I wanted to focus on, I would say, some slight differences in thesis from the Cosmos project, one of which is part of the Cosmos vision, I think, includes heterogeneous security, and part of it includes like heterogeneous architecture. And if I were to differentiate between this a bit, heterogeneous security means that validators of different blockchains are like different people or different companies. And in choosing to use one of these systems, it's like choosing to use a legal jurisdiction. You place some trust in the operators, right? And you might choose or not choose to use specific systems based on who the operators are and what the rule sets are, right? Also, the Cosmos thesis includes this like sense of heterogeneous architecture. So all of these different blockchains will be hosting different applications, and they'll be written differently for their different application. And I think like in many cases, that's probably makes sense. If you have a really like high throughput application, you could optimize the architecture for it. You have some more control. But also, I think it comes with some downsides. One downside is that it raises exit costs in a sense. So if you have all of your data tied to a specific like full stack architecture that's particular to the application and to the blockchain and to the settlement layer, then if you suddenly decide that you don't like the validator set anymore, they start doing things which you're no longer happy with, it's difficult for you to exit, because you're in this like architecturally incompatible subset of the network graph where you can't easily move your data or move your logic somewhere else. So I also think it's worth having like some standardized architectures that incorporate into higher level programming models much of what people want to do in common between different applications, so that exit costs are lower. The other thing I really wanted to focus on was privacy. And I just thought it would be like easier to start a new organization to work on that. So that became the genesis of Anoma. The project has really changed over time. I mean, initially we started with a more specific thesis of we want to support private bartering. The reason for that, I mean, for me, it's like, not that you can't do other things, just for me, it's difficult to design a system without some notion of what it is for. Like, to me, technology is a tool, and the tool is more or less like effective or useful depending on what it is for and how well it does that thing. So to use a very reductive analogy, a hammer is clearly a tool, and we describe the hammer not by what it is made out of, so like the configuration of atoms and metal, but by what it does. It hammers. And a good hammer is good at hammering, a bad hammer is not so good at hammering. Of course, there is also like, that's kind of an abstract concept of a hammer. Like, I haven't specified what the constituent materials are, how they fit together, like what makes it hard, or so to speak. So you could have lots of different hammers with different specific aspects constructed out of different materials, and you need a concrete hammer in order to do any actual hammering. But we, rather than categorize like rather than treat all different hammers with different configurations of atoms as different things, we consider them all to be hammers because to us, they are this tool with this purpose. So based on just reflecting on what is like the purpose of blockchains and decentralized settlement layers, to me, they seem most useful when you want to engage in some kind of trading or economic activity regarding with resources which are physically scarce. I'm like broadly skeptical about the usage of consensus over anything which isn't physically scarce because I don't see why you need it. But I think it could be an interesting game. But otherwise, like, I'm not sure why you need global consensus. Is really expensive.
Yes.
It introduces all of these constraints. You have hard distributed systems design problems. You have to have like governance to agree on this thing. It has scaling limitations.
And that's also true for not just computing. It's true for social coordination, of course. Right. So like
Right.
if you have unscarce resources and you have all this energy expended into how do we just like why actually there you could invert that and take the negative case of it and actually say just free access to these things, coordination here for sure. And then I think like you're in the process of telling us the story, but basically the latest version of what you folks do is kind of this, or at least the tagline is undefining money, right? So what was the lead up to undefining money? I can kind of read between the lines here, but how did you folks end up at that?
Often we approached Anoma from two perspectives and tried to switch between them. And I don't know if we've always succeeded at that, but there's a conscious strategy. And I would call those two perspectives roughly like bottom up and top down. So the bottom up perspective is what is the technology? What can it do? What does the system concretely look like? How does the consensus algorithm designed? What cryptography are we using? Like as a sort of concrete instantiation, even though it's an abstract protocol, but as a like what guarantees can the system provide? And then the top down perspective is like socially, why do we even want this thing? And what properties should it have? What properties might users care about? One of, I was reading at the time and still just a lot of content and reflections on the way in which economic systems work right now. And I became really concerned about a kind of a problem that in the Anoma paper I termed abstractive divergence. Perhaps I didn't intend to I don't want to create lexicons where lexicons don't need to be recreated. So if this has been referred to by somebody else, I would be really happy to switch my term.
Please tell us more about it, because this is just endemic to all of Cosmos people, right? Ethan Buckman's out here starting every podcast with a 10-minute explanation of sustainability, existentialism, right? So please humor us and break it down.
Right. Okay. So one way to think about this is if we think about what is the financial system. If we try and isolate this system as some mechanism with boundaries, then it's a way that we are representing states of the world over which we want to coordinate, and we choose we craft specific. You can think of it as like there's a spreadsheet says who has what money and records all of these transactions, and as a society, we have decided to accord the spreadsheet some semantic value. And this is, of course, a simplification of matters, but nothing makes money it's a social consensus. Nothing makes the specific dollar or whatever representation or rock or whatever representation we're using inherently tied to the physical goods, which presumably we're actually interested in. Like real capital is physical. If you want to be able to survive for a long time, uncertain weather conditions where you might not be able to farm, then you need physical capital. You need stored up food if you want to be able to survive. All of this has become very abstracted, but still, if we just end up in a world where we don't have any food and we have a lot of dollars and spreadsheets, clearly that does not seem to be the world that we want. So this money needs to correspond to something real, because there's something real over which we want to coordinate. But it also seems to me that in this global computer of money, a lot of outcomes are happening that, might not necessarily be really wanted by most of the participants. And this is a hard argument to make at this layer. I think it's the burden of proof is always against you or on you if you are arguing against revealed preference. So people have chosen to do these things with money, and they choose to buy all these products, and they choose to take plane flights, and they choose to do all these things that contribute to environmental degradation and contribute to degradation of the information commons. And these are choices. I mean, there may be some propaganda involved, there may be all these other systems, but if you want to argue for something else, the burden of proof is on you to explain why the revealed preference is this way. But it does seem to me like there are a lot of cases where as individuals making choices, we can easily end up creating incentives with this system of money that we don't really want to. So if I go to a store and I have a bunch of options on which soda to buy, like I see, say, this is Berlin, right? So I have Fritz Cola and I have like Coca-Cola and I have some other, I don't know, Sterni beer. Okay. And I look at these options of beverages and I see a few characteristics. I see price. I remember like I've tasted them in the past. Are they tasty? Maybe one of them has a fair trade label, something like that. And I make a decision on what beverage to buy. A lot of the preferences which I communicate in making this choice are creating incentives which are kind of invisible to me. So if I choose an absence of like differences, if I choose the cheaper of two sodas, let's say I think the taste is the same and I don't know anything else about the production practices. If I choose the cheaper of the two sodas, it may be the case that that soda is cheaper because the producer found a way to create cheaper bottles at the cost of like dumping some more pollution into a river, or because the producer found a way to manufacture the ingredients to source the sugar for the soda from somewhere where the labor conditions are really asymmetric and they don't have to pay people as much. And in fact, by choosing solely on the basis of price, I create incentives for producers to reduce costs any way they can, including sacrificing a lot of other values which I might actually have, such as this relate to production practices or environmental sustainability, right, or literally anything else. Like unless I explicitly incorporate it into my decision somehow, then any producer which can sacrifice this other value and reduce the price will be more likely to be selected by me. And so I create incentives for that producer to continue to exist. Even a label like fair trade or something like this, I mean, it can help insofar as it corresponds to a actual evaluative process put in place by some kind of body which studies practices of trade and analyzes whether people are being exploited and other characteristics. But it's a very low granularity label. As soon as there's something like fair trade, then companies are competing to be labeled fair trade. And if they could find a way to convince the body that something is fair trade while kind of adhering to the letter but not the spirit of the law, or so to speak, then that label can only add as much value as there is like actual evaluative capacity going on into assessing whether or not it's accurate, right?
Right. And so like with the way that money rides along with this, the way that you're using it here, it would be like fair trade is additive on top of the existing abstraction of money. Then fair trade maybe is attempting to break out one of the things that is a part of that abstraction, but it to itself can then be gamed. So it kind of gets you back to square one.
Right. I mean, in some sense, if you think about what money is, it is like a unidimensional representation of everything. Like we reduce all of our comparisons to this one dimension. But reality is not unidimensional. Reality is not linear. All of these choices we make have like complex cascading impacts. And if we use a system for resource allocation, and money is a system for resource allocation like this, sometimes there's this sort of capitalist socialist dichotomy where capitalism is like free choices and profit maximizing companies, and socialism is like a centralized system doing resource allocation. And we have a system doing resource allocation. It's just a question of what that system is and like what characteristics it has, at least to me. And money is a particular choice of such a system. And it is in a sense distributed. I mean, there's no like singular computer doing all the computation of where all the resources go, but I'm not sure how much that matters relative to like how high dimensional is the representation that we're using and how abstract are the supply chains. The more distant all of these choices being made by producers are to you, the less context you have. If I buy beverages in a town and like all of the commerce is contained within that town, even if it's not labeled on the bottle, I'm just likely to have a lot of context. Like I probably know the manufacturer, or like I know them through a mutual friend, or I will hear things down the gossip pipeline about what is going on. And I can incorporate these other multidimensional other characteristics into my choices because I want to support practices or not support practices, which I think will be good or bad for the health of the community. But when you combine this very deep abstract supply chain with this dimension, which is like really productive metric, you get just layers and layers of what I call abstractive divergence. So people, I would argue, inadvertently creating incentives for behaviors, especially production practices, that down the line will negatively impact their lives. Like we are impacted by damage to the global epistemic commons and climate change. It's not like sometimes you can also go too far on the like revealed preference line of thinking and say maybe people just don't care. Maybe in individual cases that's true, but I'm skeptical of it. I think it's just we're in this very alienated, currently this like very alienated relationship with our economic practice. We're like using our Paleolithic intuitions about how systems work and about what choices we make to interact with this tremendously complicated abstract system. And those intuitions don't match. And this is true in economics, it's true in privacy. All of these like interactions with complex systems have this really, really deep divergence between the expectations, in some sense reasonable or at least difficult to mutate, we have of how like far the causal impacts of our interactions go and where the information goes and the actual properties those systems have.
So, Christopher, I just want to interject here. So it seems to me that you're arguing for it. I mean, a point of what you're arguing for here is local production. And local production is the only way to really have enough context to be able to make decisions that are inclusive of your values or preferences. And I just question that. And maybe that's not what you're arguing, but it's one of the things that I think emerges from the argument that you're making, or the kind of philosophical underpinning of the argument that you're making. I would kind of disagree with that. I don't think it's so binary, right? I remember kind of in the year after business school, I went and lived in Bangladesh for a year. And I don't really see how in a place like Bangladesh, without global trade, without kind of global supply chains, you would have lifted so many women out of poverty, right? Or have a society that had every single social performance indicator improve over time, even though you had all of these kind of things like Rana Plaza and all of the kind of negative impacts of the supply chain on laborers, on the environment, et cetera, which is kind of, I think, the concrete element of what you're saying. And so what exactly are you arguing for here? I mean, I understand the concern around having these kind of abstract ways of revealing preferences through certifications or through marks, but in the world that you're imagining, how can we do it better?
I'm not necessarily arguing for more local production or less. Key element, obviously, like I live in Berlin, I live in kind of globally interact with, using this MacBook, realistically a globally interconnected economy. So if I were truly be arguing for local production and living my values, we probably wouldn't even be having this conversation. I would be off in a commune doing things purely locally. I guess I would say that I think if we are to stay with the system of very abstract commerce, there are kind of two directions we can take to reduce this abstractive divergence, if we agree that it is real. One direction we can take is to try and craft somewhat higher dimensional representations. Even the fair trade label is a step in the right direction here, right? I mean, it's not perfect, but it is better. Like there's more information now being conveyed about the production practices. And if we can improve the actual infrastructure, labeling products and communicating information about other factors which we care about, if everything were labeled with carbon outputs, for example, I think this is an improvement. It's not like complete restructuring, or so to speak, but I'm not sure that we need a complete restructuring. I mean, luckily there is, it seems to me, a sort of power law of bad things. Like some of the impacts abstractive divergence are very large and particularly catastrophic in the vein of existential risks. I would include climate change in this. I would include the production of nuclear weapon systems. I would include the damage to epistemic commons, some other things. But if more information about these can be incorporated into the system and people can incorporate it into their choices, it seems to me like at least we end up with a higher dimensional representation. So that would help. The other direction I think we can take is to alter the supply side. So that direction requires measurement. It requires that we craft infrastructure to measure trade practices or to measure the impacts of different decisions along a supply chain to these other factors which we care about, but which are not immediately captured in the price of the thing. Measurement is tricky. It's hard to architect infrastructure to measure. And as soon as you have a measurement that is being used as a selection criteria, like a fair trade label, then everyone is now optimizing for it to get the fair trade label without actually doing fair trade. So it introduces this iterated game of competition, right? Which can still be fine in practice, but you have to be realistic that we'll need to dedicate a lot of resources and effort to the labeling being accurate. It's really important that fair trade labels or that other labels that we're using in the system to convey information have real people working on determining how they are applied and what they mean. And they can, as soon as someone figures out a way to trick the labeling system, they can like incorporate that and change the labeling system. So if we just have static labels, I think it's like if most of the human intellectual power is devoted towards subverting the system will get subverted.
I want to break that down just quickly. So effectively what you're saying is that as we have more information, consumers will be able to make better choices based on that information, based on kind of the composability of that information or that data related to a product, a facility, whatever we're trying to measure in the supply chain, that essentially helps us to better reveal our preferences when it comes to our consumption behavior, which makes up 60% of GDP. And so is kind of a critical component of economic growth or development. I guess one kind of caveat I would make there, and one area or two caveats that I would make. One is that I do think that these multi-stakeholder bodies, though not perfect, though not using Web3 at all, right? And many of them don't have budgets, they're nonprofits, so they don't have budgets for technology, are kind of adapting their governance and their rules over time, right? And so even though they are not perfect, they're not static either. The second kind of dimension where I'd push back here is even with greater composability of data. So if we had carbon, or we have water, we have just every single impact on society and on the environment from every single thing that we consume or interact with, there seems to be a majority of consumers just don't care, right? And so, I mean, it's not like people aren't making fair trade. I mean, there's a certain set of people that aren't buying fair trade because they can't find it and they don't know what it means. I think a larger set of people that aren't buying it because they just don't care. And so I would push back a little bit, or maybe add to what you're saying. I think there's kind of a role for regulation here as well. And I guess that goes to the question of who controls regulation within kind of this society that you're imagining.
To be clear, I'm not sure whether or not Web3 is a useful grouping, but at least in what I'm working on, I don't view it as replacing the role of existing institutional bodies. I view it as like providing a tool for them and hoping that I'm not an expert in fair trade labeling. I am not going to pretend to be one. I'm maybe not exactly an expert, but at least have some experience in like designing distributed systems. And I view what we do with Anoma and what I work on in general as trying to come up with distributed systems that provide potentially helpful properties and articulating what those are very clearly to institutional bodies and to other people so that they can use them safely. I would say on the topic of do people actually care? I completely agree with you. In revealed preference, many people just aren't even incorporating stuff like a fair trade label. I also think that the level of preference expression that is possible people have limited time. And a lot of the ways in which collective preferences, can be expressed at the moment require a really high amount of time for people who are not very invested in the thing, which is abstract. But to make it concrete, for most people, buying soda is not the most important thing in their life, or buying beverages is not the most important thing in their life. I think if you ask most people, they probably wouldn't say I want to, I don't care at all about the environment. I think they would probably say I don't.
Or even to make it more concrete, right? If you were able to tell people, hey, by your soda purchases, let me turn it back around for you and say that you're going to add over your lifetime 10 million nanoparticles of plastic to the bottom of your lungs, right? That might be something that gets your attention, right? It all depends on what it is. If we're on the soda one, right, that's when you can basically turn it back around and say, not just the environment, but you today, right?
So let's say that there are a lot of things which you just can't easily communicate. So in particular, something I'm going to call counterfactual preferences. So if a bunch of people are choosing whether or not to buy soda, the only choices that they can make, and consequently the only information they can communicate up the supply chain with this mechanism of price, are whether or not to buy specific things that are already on sale. So this Coca-Cola chooses to produce some sodas, right, with different characteristics, then those are sent through this complex physical distribution chain to your corner store, and you choose whether or not to buy them. It might be the case that a bunch of people would be happier or happy to pay 5 cents more for soda if it were produced in a different way. But individually, if that soda is never on offer, they can't actually communicate this to Coca-Cola. There's no way other than unionizing and using some other mechanism, like the mechanism of government or something like this, to impose regulation upon Coca-Cola and try and change the incentives that way. But that requires a lot of time. So if it were easier or possible even to say, if you change the, I'm not going to buy the soda like as it stands. But if you change the production practices to incorporate this other factor that I care about, then I would. And if a bunch of people can articulate that preference and easily communicate with each other to demonstrate it kind of collectively to the producer, so the Coca-Cola company in this case, then maybe it provides a way to demonstrate, to communicate information up the supply chain about these different incentives for production now, because Coca-Cola could see, if I produce this other soda, I will now have all these customers that I currently don't have. And this game is like, both sides can be conscious of it. So let's say that you can craft expressions of preferences, which are also contingent on what other people do. So as a person buying soda, for example, I like soda. And if I know that my choice of whether or not to buy soda is not really going to change the incentives anyway, then if refusing to buy soda is not going to make Coca-Cola change their production practices, then I'll probably just buy the soda anyway. Like, what difference does it make? But if I can somehow coordinate with a bunch of the other people who are buying soda and say, like, we are all not going to buy soda unless it is changed, unless the production practice is changed in this way to incorporate things, then Coca-Cola sees that and they have two choices. They can not change their production practice and have no customers or have far fewer customers, and they can change their production practice, which probably is not that expensive anyways, and have now all of these like current customers. And the people who are articulating this preference know that the incentives work like this, right? So like the choice is not, I don't really have to give up soda. I just have to use this mechanism to negotiate with the Coca-Cola company to change the incentives for their choices. And if we can effectively unionize, or so to speak, all of these consumers, then they have complete power over the company. Like, as long as you can capture the metrics which the consumers care about, Coca-Cola is forced to either do what they want or go out of business.
Yeah.
So again, yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, John.
No, go ahead, man. Jump in.
Yeah. So I would say, so very, very cool vision first and foremost. The one area where I would think that there would be challenges is that even if a lot of these companies want to move towards sustainable practices, it takes time, right? And so, or if you look at kind of the boycotting of apartheid, where I think kind of a lot of what you're talking about kind of originated, it took time, right? It took time for behavior to change. And in this example, if a company wants to move away from a supply chain they're using, it's going to take time, right? And so, and I just think of the speed with which the Web3 or kind of consumers want change to happen may not exactly line up to the pace with which these larger organizations can actually create change. I remember when Chipotle, I'll give kind of a tangible example. Chipotle wanted to move to organic tomatoes, right? And they like came out with this thing where they're like, I think it was like 2016. They're like, we want to use organic tomatoes. And guess what? It's going to take us till 2025 to actually get enough organic production to get there, right? So I don't think that's a reason why we shouldn't move to the world that you're thinking about. And I think it's actually the world we actually have to move to. I do think there's going to be a lot of challenges for companies, which is a good thing, which is going to force them to measure more. It's going to force them to move faster. But I think that friction is going to be very frustrating for consumers as we get there.
I also think I would add to this that there's two kinds of speed here. There's the speed that exists right now with what you're saying, with how difficult it is to coordinate around a supply chain change. What does not exist at all right now, and what I think Anoma is building, sorry to pump your bags here, Christopher, is this way to coordinate preference globally with some kind of mechanism on this one key issue, right? Like the time it takes to even do that is incredibly difficult. Think about the first movers of even apartheid, right? Like it was Ireland, right? There's a few, like, then they came to the UN. There's a bunch of, you know this history better than me, but let's take something even a little bit more like the time it takes to tell people that like, this one thing that's in the supply chain is bad for you for either human rights purposes or whatever. For that message to proliferate, it has to go through NGOs, Greenpeace, whatever, right? And then like some people are annoyed by it. Some people hear about it the first time. There's no central coordinating mechanism for those people to even know that there are other people who think about this other than that existence of that organization, right? So decentralizing that in some way to say, in addition, to not make it a categorical preference, right? Where it's like, it can be a dynamic preference relative to the context, right? That's the other bit of it that I think is kind of interesting because that's a thing that honestly has existed already in like network science and social choice theory, but it just hasn't been touched, right? So like, that's kind of where I see the the innovation, I totally agree on the other side. Like here's where we'll end up, right? We'll end up in a situation where people are like, yo, we just found out today that all the cobalt and niobium in my phones comes from a Congolese mine where they're just throwing people in this ditch. I just found about this today. Oh my God. Right. And then like, of course, you're not going to find a new, like some new element that's going to do those things. Right. So you're back at square one, but you might find out that, there's a mechanism, at least beyond some dumb social media meme or what have you, that actually goes like, hey, this thing exists. And also, would you stake some of your holding in this particular proof of stake protocol to indicate how much does it matter to you relative to other things, right? And I think on that side, you still have to connect to the existing, like you're saying, Christopher, you still have to connect to the existing players. You're not trying to replace them. And you're going to, like Martin said, you're going to move at the pace of those people. But at the same time, you might have a global preference aggregation, which I think is like the innovation, right?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it's important to, at least for me, to be very honest with ourselves about like that Web3 technology and technical solutions are really only a small part of a kind of broad social change that will be required in order to change in practice these incentives in ways that are more compatible with the long-term survival and flourishing of humanity and the Earth's biosphere. I think that the primary function which a protocol like Anoma or other blockchain protocols can play is to provide a layer which can automate much of the tedious accounting. And in order to maintain a high dimensional representation of a complex global economy where you care about lots of factors, you need a lot of accounting. You need to account for causal impacts of different choices. You need to account for all of the people, who say buy a product, articulating different preferences, and you need to combine them together into ways that are legible to companies making decisions about production practices. And I think blockchain technology can help with this. You need commitments that are credible as opposed to social media where they're not credible. You need credible commitments in order to negotiate. And you need a kind of like summarization that allows, rather than, if a company sees 100,000 consumers with 100,000 different preferences, they can't actually make a decision on that basis, right? People need to agree. And this agreement can be mediated through like different structures of collective decision-making. And I think, Anoma is offering a sort of computational substrate as a tool in the collective decision-making arsenal, but one which can be helpful, but it is just like a tool in that arsenal. I've been trying to come up with a way, because I don't have a totally unified understanding of this yet. I've been trying to understand how exactly privacy fits into all of this. I think privacy is very important. I think it's important for a reason which is not completely orthogonal, but like maybe partially orthogonal to these questions of preference aggregation. I think privacy is important because it makes it much harder to manipulate people, basically with large-scale propaganda. That right now we have these almost completely public information systems where, what you say on social media and what you say to other people, and sometimes financial decisions like what you're buying, are available for everyone with their big machine learning models to compute and optimize over. And this creates just a stunning asymmetry. It's really crazy when you think about it, that we live in this world, that we've decided to inadvertently, in some sense, but that we've decided to give all of our data about what we're doing to a secret police composed of, Facebook and Google's advertising models, who are now optimizing to make money, which is like unidimensional optimization, by, convincing us to do different things in ways that are very like the cognitive cost of trying not to ever be influenced by advertisements or by what you see on the internet is really high. It's not easy to ignore this. And the impact, especially on, I think it's easy I use an ad blocker and Brave, and although certainly not in any way perfect, I think many of us are kind of insulated from the worst impacts of this. And occasionally I, go work on a computer with my aunt or someone who's just people from a different generation and with a different like level of familiarity with the technology. And the internet is an awful place, man. Like, it's full of ads and it's just completely manufactured. And
as the parent of an 8-year-old, I totally agree. it's kind of
like
brutal
awful.
out there.
Yeah. Not a place you want your kids to grow up in. So I think that, there may be some plausible cases. I think the burden of proof is on why the data should be public in the first place, because having public data creates a lot of opportunity for propaganda. And the damage to the information commons arguably is like the central problem, because as long as we have divergent and propagandized views and memes propagating all around, it's very hard to make collective decisions on anything, even where there are, say, clear scientific consensus on certain things, for example. So I think that we really just have to make it impossible for people to like, it's not a good idea for so much data about human behavior to be public that it can be modeled and optimized on. And we should go back to a world where it's private. And while, cryptography and blockchain technology is only part of this, I mean, I think like privacy and communications, like using Signal, using secure messaging protocols that have really the same kind of information architecture as talking to people in person, where the intuition matches quite well. If you use Signal, you're talking to someone, you know that they will know. You talk to people in a group, you know that they will know and no one else knows. That's like talking to people in the physical world. And I think the technology has to match that intuition, because the intuition isn't really going to change. And the intuition is like good anyways. It's, when you talk to people who you have a lot of context with, you kind of trust their statements more. Like there's a very natural accounting that goes on there without thinking about it explicitly that already works quite well. And we've diverged from this with digital protocols. And I think kind of just the wave is coming back and we need to reconverge. So all that's very abstract. But what Anoma tries to do concretely is provide as much privacy as is possible for this kind of bartering and other kinds of interactions, which you might want to do in private. And there are some tricky trade-offs here. The trickiest trade-off actually has nothing to do with settlement. So most blockchains are focused on settlement, which is like you already agree on the transaction, which is what state transitions might be, and you just want to settle it. Say in Zcash, like saying someone a payment, it's easy to make settlement private because you can use ATPs for all of that. Counterparty discovery is harder to make private, because in order to find people who potentially share your preferences or who are potentially counterparties to a trade, you need to reveal something about what your preferences are. Otherwise, it's like a ludicrously complex exponential storage problem. So at the moment, we've architecturally in Anoma crafted a system where you can reveal the what, but not the who in the counterparty discovery layer. So you can reveal, I want to trade like X or Y, or I have this preference. If a bunch of other people have this preference, we can work together without revealing your identity. I think that's like probably an improvement over existing systems. I'm not sure if it's enough. We also, you can choose where and how you share those preferences. And as soon as you find people you agree with, you can combine them together or partially combine them together. So there are different degrees of anonymity. And once you settle it on the ledger, no one knows about it.
Well, I think you introduced some interesting ideas here. And I think I waited far too long to interject on this one earlier in the podcast, but we'll put this in the show notes. But have you read Wynne Sterling's work of the theory of social choice on networks?
No, but I would.
So it seems like in the software architecture and the real life existing human problems you're trying to solve, you've actually built patterns that help people say like, let's break it down into a real life situation, right? Just background context, right? Social choice theory emerged out of Kenneth Arrow's impossibility theorem from a book I forget the name of the book, but it was like 50, 60 years ago he published it. And like the idea basically, there's a separate idea that's super powerful that emerged, which I'm not going to touch on. But one of the key things is basically that this entire area of theory basically has converged around the idea that people have fixed preference orderings. And sometimes I wonder if that's because it just makes the math easier, right? Because like when you talk to a human, right? Like, and there, you can imagine scenarios where you say like, would you want in this moment, an apple juice on this 93 degree, 30 Celsius day, or would you like, this 50 pounds of potatoes? And of course, that you can just say, well, I would always want the 50 pounds of tomatoes in a fixed preference ordering, but the situation changes. And what if you're on your way to a party with your friends and you're going to fry those and barbecue them with, some other thing that you're doing now? There's dynamism in those choices, right? So I ask just because we've talked a lot about revealed preference. We've talked about intents, but it seems like with Anoma, one of the key things you're actually doing is you're taking that's literally in your software, right? So you have something like revealed preference and you've been talking about privacy. I'm really interested in this idea where if you have, how do you actually preserve privacy while also figuring out this group of people want something, right? Like we can say, you can go back to your Coke example and say, we want Coke to take BPA line cans out of their production supply chain. And we want to make sure that they're using watersheds that are plastic free so that we're not, poisoned by it. But then Coke's and be like, well, who are these people? Right? Like, how do you actually manage privacy in a situation where you're trying to kind of exert democratic governance the other way around, right? In this kind of situation, what are your thoughts on that?
Right. I mean, in this specific case, I think it's maybe a way to start is by understanding what are the like requirements of proof in order for this negotiation to work. I think in this case, and in most cases of supply chain negotiation, we don't need a strong notion of identity. I think all we really need is that Coca-Cola needs to be convinced that these people are actually that they buy Coca-Cola.
They're real, first of all.
Right.
But yes.
I want to make this a harder example. So sorry to interrupt you,
Yeah.
right? So I want to make this a harder example. Let's use the example not of Coca-Cola, okay? So let's use the example of a small farmer that's moved to organic in Maine and has recently found out that because of a policy in the last 30 years, that a ton of the farmland in Maine is PFAS contaminated, okay? And so they've been selling organic for the last 10 years. And now effectively they have to go back to all the consumers that have bought from them. And there's complete visibility as to who they were buying from. And how do they deal with this kind of, how do you create this kind of layer of privacy in a way that benefits everyone in that example? Because I think Coca-Cola is like the easy example. It's like, this is an evil company that's focused on, where a bunch of people are kind of fighting for a quarter point in the cola wars. And we all can say, okay, this is kind of a company that we can go after. But let's use an example that's a little bit more nuanced and that's a real example that I just gave you, right? So 18 million, 20 million acres of farmland in the US has just recently been discovered to be PFAS contaminated based on using sludge, right? And all of these farmers didn't know when they bought the property that this had happened because they essentially, used this input that was given to them. So anyways, let's use that example.
Yes. Time for theoretical blockchain architectures meet real world problems. I mean, in this, do I correctly understand that what is desired here on the part of the farmer is, honestly, is to communicate to prior purchasers without revealing more information than is necessary, that their land was in fact
well, I think it's more like, let's imagine your solution's built and everyone's using it, right? And so I have a preference, and I've teamed up with another 5 million people in the Northeast corridor to purchase organic food, right? Or directly from farmers. And that's my revealed preference, right? And all of a sudden, and I don't have to give anything about my identity. I don't have to give anything about who I am or what I am. All of a sudden, I realized that, wow, I've been consuming this stuff that's actually poisonous to my health and causes cancer, right? And so there's a contingent liability for the farmer in this example. And so what I'm trying to understand is how do you balance in the model that you're thinking about the needs of the firm or the supplier with the needs of the consumer in a way that doesn't create these adverse situations. And maybe this is too theoretical, but I think it's a harder example than say kind of the Coca-Cola example.
Right. I mean, this strikes me as an example where you really need negotiation. You need to be able to capture on the part of, and you need to be able to capture these physical restrictions. So you need to be able to capture on the part of the consumers that they want to eat organic and that they don't want specific deleterious health impacts, right? And you need to capture on, I mean, there's also a measure here of maybe we want to give the farmers some credit for not knowing that they were honest in this example, right? And they didn't really know that this land was contaminated, and in a sense, it's not their fault. But we also want to capture that the consumers now want this land, the land that the farmer is using, to change, and that there are physical restrictions to how fast that can happen. So all of those conditions seem to me they really necessitate negotiation. It's important for the consumers to be able to articulate their preferences of organically grown. It's important for the farmer to be able to articulate what things they can physically do with the land, or the ways in which they can and maybe here there are other systems involved, there's a system of land provisioning and ownership. And in a sense, it also should be a counterparty involved here, because whatever was supposed to guarantee the properties of this land failed, and that maybe should be involved in reprovisioning other land to the farmers. I think blockchain or sort of distributed computation technology can be helpful here as a way of accounting preferences in assembling different counterfactuals as to what would different parties prefer and what are alternatives which are preferred by everyone. They don't really no blockchain captures the physical processes of growing stuff in soil. You can represent them in different ways, but some human experts who know things about soil and know things about pesticides and know things about the biology involved will need to model like what are the actual physical options. And once those options are modeled, maybe Anoma or some other platform can provide a kind of like helpful digital substrate just for negotiating over what would people prefer, because there are a lot of people involved in this example, and it's hard to talk to all of them. And I think in that context, you probably, you don't, at least maybe you want some privacy, like in a broad sense, and also you don't, you don't want to handle more data than necessary just for complexity reasons. Like you probably want to know about who is going to buy from this farmer and what their preferences are, but you don't necessarily need to know other things. So I think that like having the ability to compute over aggregated preferences of the consumers and giving the consumers access into like what are the physical options of the farmers, maybe other parties come into play here to, provide some kind of bridge. Like maybe we need to give this farmer some, time and capital so that they can go craft their farm somewhere else, which takes physical time and resources. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, some other farmers can step in with the assumption that there'll be like some payback in the future when the physical resources have caught up with the preferences that we're trying to satisfy. I don't know if that exactly answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the tension I'm trying to get at is earlier we talked about kind of the challenges within the supply chain because we have a lack of context because our supply chains are so far flung, right? And here, the design layer that I'm hearing in kind of creating privacy is solving for dealing with the surveillance capitalist state and markets we now kind of live in. We want to add this privacy layer so that consumers don't have to reveal their preferences. But that seems almost antithetical to designing systems that utilize supply chains to kind of reveal those preferences and then build community through those preferences, right? Because effectively, we're treating there's almost like this antagonistic relationship between consumers and producers. But in reality, most of us are both, right? And so the areas where this has worked really well is where we've designed for community, where we've designed for kind of consumers interacting with producers. And so I just want to kind of question a little bit the need for the privacy layer or like the assumption that privacy is critical within the system in all applications. And maybe that's just my own bias.
No. I mean, I think like, to me, at least, privacy is a default. It's not a totalizing philosophy. So privacy doesn't mean that all data is private. It means that you choose what data to reveal. So it's not really like, it's not like it's a private system versus a public system. It's just at the moment we have like data publicity as an externality, that when interacting with large scale digital systems, you're revealing all of this data like basically unconsciously, or it's hidden behind, cookie agreements that are written in obscure legalese, or it's like implicitly sent when you click buttons and apps on your phone, or it's sold by your bank, unless you have strong data protection laws, to parties without, realistically, without your knowledge or consent. And I just, privacy to me, at least, is like moving to a different default where data doesn't like go places unless you want it to, or unless you've, in a more, some of this is a continuum. It's not, not a binary choice. You can maybe choose to display some data by default to specific producers, or you can display aggregates, which don't reveal so much individual personal information. I think that's great. Building privacy technology just at least makes more points along that spectrum possible. Right now, basically all of the control mechanisms for enforcing, properties we care about in a currency, or like whatever rules that we're enforcing in our digital system, even if the digital system is Facebook, right? All that requires that you send all your data to a centralized server, and then a centralized server enforces the rules. And cryptography just like allows you to do the same kind of, craft something like social media or something like a financial system, while independently choosing who gets to see what data, because you can separate out verification from data visibility. So I think it just like opens a spectrum, and then subject to like the actual requirements of the physical world and who needs to know what in order to make what choices, then, the users of the system can choose who should be able to see what data.
I guess kind of just closing out the example that we gave, and the example where you then have those consumers that want to sue the farmer because they now have cancer, they're going to have to reveal who they are, right? So in a lawsuit, right? And so there's kind of the selective privacy mechanism But in the example that we gave, there's probably, if this led to a really bad outcome where you have this contingent liability associated with something that a producer didn't know about or that a firm didn't know about, you then go into kind of the legal system, which then gets into governance and a conversation about governance. But, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole.
Well, I think both of you backed into an interesting point, which is that, and this is a point that you get into in a piece that you wrote a few months ago, Christopher, around against decentralized finance. And the part of it that caught my attention is this part where you kind of mentioned, you run through 3 examples, and all of them really vibed with me. But it was stuff like when builders, engineers, folks who are building things in the world, put a product out there, they're often divorced from the communities who use it. And then this mere abstraction creates the opportunity for unintended harms to kind of get out there, right? So I think like one of the things, this is honestly like right up the theme of the podcast, is the whole thing that we're interested in this idea of ownership, which is that if you can expand the circle of ownership and bring in more forms of governance and more parties into that governance, the stakeholder ownership incentives can lead folks to better outcomes, right? And so I think like within this example around, our somewhat contrived but very true example of things that are happening right now in Maine around organic farming and PFAS, with all the sorts of mechanisms we've talked about that Anoma kind of can do, right? There's this idea of intents, and there's this idea of, which I really like this part of it as well, this idea of a matchmaker, which I think it's a nod to the fact that I understood it as a human agent that can then look at like these kinds of things, or a model that can say, here are potential matches given the aggregation, like clusterings of choice from all of the aggregation of intents, right? So I think like when you think about that, it kind of I'd be interested in hearing, like, both of you hit on this, right? We have to connect the communities to the things that are doing this. How do you see that shaking out in the near term with what you folks have built?
Right. I mean, to me, I promise this is an answer, even though I will go at it from a slightly different angle. One aspect of, to me, like the part of decentralized that matters is like the self-sovereign part. Just like decentralized as fetish doesn't really mean anything. You need to be more specific. And that in crafting technology that people are going to use to operate systems which are important, like semantically important in their daily lives, like the financial system, which have real impacts, people need to control and have access to the internals of their own technology. And there is already a danger in like crafting technology for financial systems with complex computer systems that most people don't understand. Like a hammer is a very safe tool because it's like everyone who uses a hammer understands the externalities. If you hit your thumb, it will hurt. Like, maybe the hammer production carried some, could have some complexity in it, but mostly the usage of the tool and its impacts are very simple. And, I think like arguably as a species, we've adopted this large abstract financial system before we understood really what it did. And certainly I, in like the context of my everyday choices, do not understand all of the impacts that I am having. And I think that's like scary. And it's a failure of a tool. I mean, I don't think, I don't know if that's a very big problem. It's difficult to address it all at once, but I think there are ways that we can move in that direction. And in particular with anything used to run a financial system, I think control by communities over their own infrastructure is very, like, if we look at the real world topology of commerce, most of the commerce that happens in Berlin, by people who live in Berlin is like with people who are living in Berlin. And it's kind of odd that we're settling this on a financial backbone operated like some other European place. Both it's like unnecessary from a latency perspective, and it creates this divergence of now there are people controlling the system, people using the system, and they become more separate. And I think, in general, I want to try and design systems which bring those closer together. So in the case of Anoma, we have this fractal instance model where we expect people to run different instances, which similar to like, how the internet protocol is like one protocol, but then you have different routers and you connect different computers. And Anoma is a protocol that you can use for private bartering and private state transitions and intent gossip and matchmaking, all of these things. But the choice of what protocol to use is orthogonal. We try to make it orthogonal to the choice of who is operating it, with the expectation that if you're using this for commerce in your community, you should be operating it, not us. And you should choose whatever mechanism, maybe that's proof of stake, maybe it's not, whatever mechanism for control of this this consensus and matchmakers makes sense in your context. And that even like how you operate that is up to you, and what, and it's kind of private. The outside world doesn't need to care They can see the community as this sort of abstraction, and whatever consensus mechanism you're using is that. And you can, maybe there are shared assets that you're using across different fractal instances, but there's a kind of only a modicum of information, whatever needs to be shared in order to enable the interactions that you want to enable across this boundary. So I think it's important to give communities control over their boundaries and over the systems which operate within them. I will say that, so in terms of matchmaking, the matchmaking Anoma does is computational. I mean, it could be done by a human, but since we're operating with digital systems and like discretely expressed preferences, it's sort of digital. I think digital expression of preferences in matchmaking is not always the right choice. I think it's like helpful when really the challenge is one of computational feasibility. It's difficult to, like in say direct democratic systems with a lot of participants, really the bottleneck is not on the voting. If you're a canton of 10,000 people in Switzerland and you're voting on referenda, most of the decision making happens in which referenda get placed on the ballot, right?
Correct.
So that's the actual bottleneck. And that bottleneck is a bottleneck of preference aggregation into what are even the options. I mean, it seems to be plausible that digital systems can help here where things could be pretty concretely expressed. They're not perfect, but the computational aggregation matters so much that sometimes, and with money, we're already doing this, right? So maybe we can at least just do it better. That if you can express things in a slightly higher dimensional way and make them discrete, then you can use the digital, kind of compute to aggregate discrete preferences and matchmake across them. I think that could be useful.
And so if you had something that, is defining in some language, in your instance, it's Rust, not that necessarily matters. I'm just a Rust stan, throwing Rust out there for everybody. But point being that you can model these things in roughly natural language. I mean, you can look at the code that you guys put up there. It's almost like that where you can read it and it's human readable. So the idea then is that if you get let's run with your Swiss canton example, right? With 10,000 people, it's not even about the referenda. It's about what do we even want to make decisions on, and relative to particular outcome, maybe it's stewarding, there's a public good, like a public ski, thing or whatever. Maybe there's how often you used it, who upkeeps it, how much you want to pay for it, whatever. You could use something like what you folks have built to then run this matchmaking model and say what has emerged from these intents and preferences. Is that kind of how it works?
Yeah. I mean, I think we can start from in theory, if everyone had tons and tons of time, they could write down all of the different public goods they're interested in funding, or all of the different configurations for the ski area which they like. And if they write those down discretely, then the Anoma intent gossip and matchmaking system could help find combinations of these different counterfactual ideas, these different fictions of what possible ski areas are and who would like which one. It could help find, the matchmaking system can help find combinations which are satisfactory in whatever facet we've defined. 2/3 of people in our community are in favor of them, or it's Pareto optimal given some prior choice or something like this, right? That is a choice. What even is the metric by which we choose?
Yes.
But the matchmaking system can help there. I mean, realistically, still there's all limitations on time, but I think there's this interesting intermediate space where where people are choosing some kind of content-specific delegation of trust. So, to me, trust is heterogeneous. I have lots of friends and they have expertise in different things and I know them in different ways. And I would often trust, if I have a friend who's, really an expert on climate physics, I would be happy to kind of delegate some of my decision-making about what my preferences even are or should be in the interactions with this complex system to him or to her. But I probably wouldn't want to delegate my decision-making about cryptography, right? I might do that myself, or I might delegate it to somebody else. But I think a network of delegated heterogeneous trust can alleviate some of the time limitations in running higher dimensional direct democracy systems. So I think there's a lot of design space there. We haven't seen tons of this in practice yet, but
yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense because all of this stuff is embedded inside of a system, in another system that also, in your words, kind of has abstractive divergence voting, right? Because having delegating trust, heterogeneous trust in the setting only goes through one system, and that's who we're voting for, who makes the canton decisions, right? But that is a abstractive divergence to who has a nice personality cult in the local area, who can delegate the most social capital, who can find the appealing message, etc. Right? And all of that is completely separate from who can make the best decision for this. So all of that to say that I think this is a pretty fascinating platform you folks have put together, and I've reached the end of this now, understanding what you mean by undefining money. It's almost as if you are deconvoluting money, right? There's a lot of convolutions in the flows of money and information that's embedded in it. There's value abstractions. There's a bunch of other things, and by providing tools that actually kind of deconvolute the things that are wrapped up in that, you can begin to disaggregate them and say, what about this one that branches off this way? We can make a different decision about it in a different value system, maybe not just rolling value up into one metric. And this is also another thing that's near and dear to my heart. So very cool, Christopher. Thanks for taking us on that trip through it. Very much appreciated. Then these last few seconds of it, I'll kind of kick it over to you. Where can folks follow Anoma and your work online?
Yeah, thank you. And I hope that I have not diverged abstractly so far in this conversation from whatever the original topic set was that everyone is very confused.
No, I think we managed to hit almost all of them, and we hit them in a really roundabout, interesting conversational way. So yeah, absolutely. Don't worry about it.
You can find Anoma at anoma.net and on Twitter, Anoma Network. We're also, so Anoma, as you might have gleaned from this wildly meandering discussion, is complicated, and we're not going to launch the whole thing all at once. We're going to try and launch it in, or at least offer software, which is self-contained, coherent in stages. The first stage being this summer with a network called Nomada, which just supports multi-asset private transfers, and you can find that online at nomada.net as well. I'd love to, another, we didn't really get into this, but I think just to drop in some hot, spicy takes. Please. I think blockchains are competing with governments, not other blockchains. And in competing with governments, the primary thing they need to figure out an interesting way to do is public goods funding as operating informational or financial systems. That what governments do, which is really, really completely necessary, is public goods funding. And if we want to provide credible alternatives, we need to be trying to do this, which is hard. Just building money is not that hard. But if you don't fund public goods, then we're not building a credible alternative. So we're also doing some experimentation in that regard. And I would really love to talk to anyone who is thinking about public goods funding mechanisms, humane protocol design, other sorts of aspects of this integration.
Super cool, man. We will probably just invite you back on in 3 months to talk about public goods funding. To be honest, we could do an entire episode on that with you folks, with the way that you are innovating in that space. And we'd love to hear updates from you for sure. So awesome. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you.